The cold was the first thing he really noticed, a deep, biting cold that seemed to live in his bones. It wasn't just the November air outside. It was a chill that had settled inside him over weeks of uncertainty. His stomach was a hollow ache, a quiet but constant reminder of his situation. It wasn't a loud, angry growl demanding food, but a dull, persistent gnawing like a small animal chewing on the lining of his insides. Every step he took seemed to echo this emptiness. He pulled his thin jacket tighter, a useless gesture against the wind that whipped around the tall buildings downtown. He felt invisible, a ghost drifting through a world of people who seemed to have a purpose, a destination, a warm meal waiting for them at the end of the day. He had walked past the department store 3 times already. The first time, he was just passing. The second time, he was drawn by the wave of warm air that rushed out every time the automatic doors slid open. The third time, he was making a decision. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handful of change. He counted it carefully, his cold fingers fumbling with the coins. $3.72. It wasn't enough for a meal, not even a cheap one, but it was enough for a cup of coffee. And in this world, a cup of coffee was more than just a drink. It was a ticket. It was a reason to sit inside, to feel the artificial heat on his face, to borrow just a little bit of comfort from a world that had shut him out. He pushed the change back into his pocket and walked toward the glass doors. They hissed open, and the warmth hit him like a physical blow. It was so intense it almost made him dizzy. The air inside smelled of perfume and popcorn and something else, something clean and synthetic. It was the smell of money, of things for sale, of a life he used to know. He kept his head down, not wanting to make eye contact with the well-dressed shoppers bustling past with their bags and their bright, happy chatter. He made a beeline for the small coffee counter tucked away in a corner, his heart thumping a little with the small transaction he was about to make. 1 small coffee. "Please," he mumbled, placing his coins on the counter. The barista, a young woman with a tired smile, didn't seem to notice his worn clothes or the desperate look in his eyes. She just scooped up the change, poured the coffee, and handed it to him. The cup was hot in his hands, a small, welcome island of warmth in a sea of cold. He didn't add sugar or cream. He just wanted the heat. He found a hard plastic bench in the store's large central atrium and sat down. The first time he'd been off his feet for hours. The first sip of coffee was bitter and burned his tongue. But he didn't care. The heat spread down his throat and into his chest, a temporary reprieve from the hunger. He held the cup with both hands, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. From here he could see everything. He saw mothers with strollers, couples holding hands, teenagers laughing at their phones. They were all part of a flow, a current of life that he was no longer in. He was a rock in the middle of a rushing river. And then, through a gap in the crowd, he saw it. The piano dot. It was a grand piano, big and black and gleaming under the bright spotlights of the atrium. It sat on a slightly raised platform like a king on its throne right in the middle of the marble floor. It was completely out of place, a piece of pure art in a temple of commerce. It looked like it belonged in a grand concert hall, where people would dress up and sit in silence just to listen to its music. Here, it was just another item on display, a piece of decor to make the store seem more elegant. Taped to the music stand was a small white sign with neat black letters, "Please do not touch." To everyone else it was just a piece of furniture. But to him it was a beacon. It was everything. His eyes were drawn to it, unable to look away. He could almost feel the smooth, cool ivory keys under his fingers. He could imagine the weight of the keys, the way they would respond to his touch, the way the sound would fill this huge, noisy space and make everyone stop and listen. His guitar case was leaning against the bench next to him, empty and silent. He hadn't even bothered to take his guitar out today. The few coins people had tossed into his case over the past week weren't worth the cold, weren't worth the feeling of being ignored. But the piano was different. The piano commanded attention. He took another sip of his coffee, the bitter liquid doing little to distract him from the pull of the instrument. He remembered a time not so long ago when music was his life. He played in small bars and smoky rooms where people actually listened. He wrote his own songs about hope and loss and the beauty of a rainy day in the city. He had a band, and they dreamed of making it big, of hearing their songs on the radio. But dreams, he had learned, don't pay the rent. And they certainly don't buy you dinner. One by one, the band members had left, trading their dreams for steady jobs and regular paychecks. He was the last one, still holding on, still believing in the power of a melody. But his belief was starting to fade, worn down by hunger and loneliness. He watched as a little girl, no older than 6, broke away from her mother and ran towards the piano. Her eyes were wide with wonder. She reached out a small hand, her fingers just inches from the keys, before her mother gently caught her arm and pulled her back. "No, sweetie, we can't touch that," she said softly, leading her daughter away. The young man felt a pang of something sharp in his chest. It was a mix of sadness and frustration. That piano was meant to be touched. It was meant to be played. Its silence was a crime. He finished his coffee, the last drop cold and bitter. The cup was empty now, just like his stomach, just like his guitar case. The warmth was gone, replaced by the familiar chill that seemed to be his constant companion now. He knew he should get up. He should walk out of the warm store and back into the cold street. He should find a shelter for the night or a quiet doorway to huddle in. That was the sensible thing to do. But he couldn't move. His eyes were locked on the piano, on the black and white keys that held a world of possibilities. The hunger was still there, a dull ache in his belly. But another kind of hunger was growing stronger, a hunger deep in his soul. It was a hunger to create, to feel the music flow through him, to fill this cold, empty space with something beautiful. He looked at the "Please do not touch" sign, then back at the empty benches around the piano. The store was busy, but no one was really watching. No one was really paying attention. He took a deep breath, the decision settling in his mind. He was a musician, after all, and a musician has to play. The decision, once made, felt like a heavy stone dropping into the quiet pool of his mind. The ripples spread out, touching every part of him. There was fear, cold and sharp. There was excitement, a tiny flicker of warmth in the vast, cold cavern of his chest. And there was a deep, undeniable need. He placed his empty coffee cup on the bench, a small white placeholder for the spot he was about to leave. His legs felt stiff as he stood up, and a wave of dizziness washed over him for a second. He blamed it on the hunger, a constant companion that made the world tilt at the most inconvenient times. He took a slow breath, waiting for the marble floor to stop spinning. He began to walk, his footsteps soft on the polished stone. Each step was a negotiation. A part of him screamed to turn back, to sit down, to become invisible again. It was the part of him that knew the rules of the street. Don't make trouble, don't draw attention, survive. But another part, a deeper, older part of him, was pushing him forward. It was the part of him that was a musician, a creature of sound and feeling. To see that piano, silent and waiting, and to just walk away would be a kind of death, a small, quiet death of the soul. He couldn't let that happen. Not today. As he got closer, the piano seemed to grow larger, more real. He could see the tiny scratches on its glossy black surface, the way the spotlights reflected in a million tiny points of light. He could see the "Please do not touch" sign more clearly now, the letters neat and unforgiving. It felt like a direct warning to him, a personal challenge. He glanced around, a quick, nervous sweep of the area. A security guard stood near the main entrance, his back turned, busy watching the flow of people coming and going. A few store employees were folding shirts on a table nearby, their attention focused on their tasks. No one was looking at the piano. No one was looking at him. He was just another body moving through the space, another ghost in the machine. He reached the edge of the low platform where the piano sat. For a moment, he just stood there, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was the point of no return. If he sat down, if he touched those keys, there would be no pretending it was an accident. He would be breaking a rule, stepping out of line. He thought about the consequences. Being yelled at, being grabbed by the arm, being marched out of the only warm place he'd been in hours. The shame of it burned his cheeks. But then he thought about the alternative. The silence. The cold. The empty feeling inside him that had nothing to do with his stomach. He thought about the little girl who wanted to touch the keys, the wonder in her eyes. This wasn't just for him anymore. It was for her, for everyone who had ever looked at something beautiful and been told not to touch, with a final, silent prayer to whoever might be listening. He stepped up onto the platform and sat down on the bench. The velvet was worn but soft, and it felt surprisingly good beneath him. He was close enough now to feel the cool air that seemed to radiate from the piano's polished surface. He ran his fingers lightly over the keys, not pressing them down, just letting them drift over the ivory and ebony. It was like a promise. His hands were cold, and he was worried his fingers would be too stiff to work properly. He flexed them, trying to get some feeling back into the tips. He took one last look at the crowd. They were a blur of motion and color, a river of humanity flowing around his small, still island. No one had noticed. He was safe for now. He closed his eyes. It was the most important thing he could do. Shutting out the world shut out the fear, the hunger, the faces of the people who might judge him. In the darkness behind his eyelids, there was only him and the piano. He placed his fingers on the keys. His right thumb finding middle C, he took a slow, deep breath and pressed down. The note that rang out was clear and pure. A single, perfect sound that cut through the noise of the store like a laser. It was louder than he expected, fuller and richer. It hung in the air for a moment, demanding to be heard. He held his breath, waiting for the shout, the hand on his shoulder. Nothing happened. The river of people kept flowing. The world kept turning. He let out the breath he didn't realize he was holding. He pressed another key, and then another, a simple C major scale, climbing up and then sliding back down. It was the most basic thing a musician can play, a simple exercise. But as he played it, he wasn't thinking about the notes. He was thinking about the feel of the keys, the way they responded to his touch, the vibration of the sound traveling up through his fingers and into his bones. It was a conversation. He was asking the piano a question, and it was answering him with its voice. The scale felt too safe, too rehearsed. He needed more. He let his fingers wander, letting a melody form from the simple chords. It wasn't a song he knew. It wasn't something he had practiced. It was a feeling translated directly into sound. The melody was sad at first, a reflection of the cold and the hunger. It was a lonely tune, the kind of music you hear late at night when you're the only one awake. It spoke of empty rooms and fading dreams. As he played, he forgot where he was. He forgot about the department store and the people and the fear of being caught. He was just a musician, and his instrument was singing his song. The melody began to change. It was no longer just sad. A new thread of sound appeared, a note of hope, a flicker of defiance against the darkness. It was a small, stubborn sound, like a single flower growing through a crack in the concrete pavement. The music grew a little stronger, a little more complex. It was the story of his struggle, the story of anyone who has ever been hungry or lost or alone but refused to give up. He wasn't just playing notes anymore. He was telling his story, the truest story he knew, without saying a single word. He was so lost in the music that he didn't see the first person stop. It was an older man walking with his wife who suddenly halted in his tracks. He turned his head, his eyes searching for the source of the sound that had broken through the noise of his own thoughts. He saw the young man at the piano, his eyes closed, his body swaying slightly with the music. The man put a hand on his wife's arm, stopping her too. They stood there, a small island of stillness in the rushing crowd, and they listened. Another person stopped. And then another. A small group began to form, a silent audience drawn in by the raw, honest sound of a lonely piano in a busy world. But the young man at the keys didn't see any of it. For him, there was only the music, and for the first time in a long time he felt full. The music had a life of its own now. It was no longer just a collection of notes he was pressing out of the piano. It was a living, breathing thing that filled the vast space of the atrium, pushing back against the noise of the cash registers and the cheerful pop music playing over the store's speakers. His own world, the small, cold world of hunger and worry, had shrunk down to the size of the piano bench. Everything else had fallen away. He wasn't a hungry young man in a thin jacket anymore. He was just a conduit, a vessel for the sound that was flowing through him. The vibration of the strings traveled up through the keys, into his fingers, up his arms, and seemed to settle right in the center of his chest, a warm, humming presence that was more filling than any meal could ever be. The dull ache in his stomach was still there, but it was a distant echo, a background noise to the symphony playing inside him. He let the melody wander where it wanted to go. It told the story of the cold wind on his face, the feeling of being invisible, the sharp sting of pride when he had to count out coins for a cup of coffee. But as the music unfolded, it began to change. It wasn't just a story of sadness anymore. A new note crept in, a note of defiance. It was the sound of someone refusing to be beaten down, the sound of a small flame flickering in a strong wind. The melody grew stronger, more complex. It was like he was building a house with the notes, starting with a shaky foundation of loneliness and slowly adding walls of hope and a roof of stubborn joy. He was so completely lost in this act of creation that he had no idea what was happening just a few feet away, the river of people that had been flowing past. The piano was starting to form eddies and pools. A man in a business suit, on his way to a meeting, stopped walking. He was looking at his phone, his thumb scrolling through emails, but his head lifted. His fingers stopped moving. He stood there, a confused expression on his face, as if he couldn't place the sound that was cutting through the noise of his busy day. A young mother, pushing a stroller and trying to soothe a fussy baby, paused. The crying quieted. The baby's head turned toward the sound, its eyes wide and curious. The mother looked from her child to the young man at the piano, a soft, wondering smile touching her lips. A group of teenagers, laughing and showing each other videos on their phones, fell silent one by one. They didn't put their phones away, but their screens went dark as they too turned their attention to the source of the music. A small, silent crowd was gathering. It wasn't an organized thing. People just stopped. They formed a loose semicircle around the piano, creating a space that felt different from the rest of the store. The air in this new space was thicker, charged with a quiet energy. The hustle and bustle of the shopper's world seemed to fade into the background, replaced by a shared, unspoken understanding. Something special was happening here, and no one wanted to be the one to break the spell. They were strangers from different walks of life, but for a few moments, the music was making them one dot, and then, through a gap in the small crowd, he saw her. She was an elderly woman leaning on a cane with a silver handle. She had moved closer than anyone else, standing just a few feet from the piano. She wasn't looking at his hands or at the keys. Her eyes were closed, her face tilted slightly upward as if she were listening to a voice from the heavens. She was completely still, a statue carved from marble and memory. As he watched her, still playing without conscious thought, he saw a single tear escape from beneath her closed eyelid. It traced a slow, deliberate path down her wrinkled cheek, catching the light from the store's spotlights like a tiny, perfect diamond. It wasn't a tear of sadness, or at least not just sadness. It was a tear of recognition, of deep, profound feeling. Seeing her, seeing that tear, something inside him shifted. He was no longer just playing for himself, lost in his own world. He surfaced from the deep ocean of his music and became aware of the silence that had fallen around him. The song he was playing reached a natural, quiet end. His fingers rested on the keys, and the last note faded into the air. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full. It was a heavy, expectant silence, the kind you find in a concert hall between movements of a symphony. He opened his eyes, which he hadn't realized were still closed, and saw them all. The crowd. The faces. Dozens of eyes were on him, not with judgment or annoyance, but with a kind of quiet reverence. A wave of panic, hot and sharp, washed over him. He had been caught. The fear of being dragged away, of being shamed in front of all these people, surged up in his throat. He almost slammed the keyboard shut and ran. But then he looked at the elderly woman again. She had opened her eyes, and they were fixed on him. There was no anger in her gaze. There was only gratitude, a deep, soulful connection that went beyond words. In that moment, the fear melted away, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a very long time, a sense of purpose. He was not a trespasser. He was a performer. And this was his audience. He took a deep breath, and without thinking, he began to play again. This time, the music was different. It was no longer a lonely cry into the void. It was a gift. It was an offering to the people who had stopped to listen, and especially to the old woman with the tear on her cheek. The melody that emerged was softer, more open. It was a conversation now. He was telling them about his hope, his fragile, stubborn hope, and they were listening. He could feel their collective attention, a warm, gentle weight that settled around him. The music swelled, growing in confidence and beauty. It was a melody that spoke of shared human experience, of the pain and the joy that connect us all. He played as if his life depended on it, because in a way it did. He was playing not just to fill the silence, but to fill the empty spaces in people's hearts, including his own. The music rose to a beautiful, powerful crescendo, a wave of sound that washed over everyone in the crowd. And as he held the final ringing chord, his eyes met the eyes of the old woman, and he knew that she understood. She understood everything. The final chord hung in the air, shimmering and alive, before it slowly began to fade. It didn't just disappear. It seemed to dissolve into the very fabric of the atrium, leaving behind a silence that was more powerful than any sound. It was a heavy, sacred quiet, the kind that falls in a forest after a bird has finished its song. The young man's fingers rested on the keys, feeling the faint, lingering vibration. For a moment he was completely still, his eyes closed, half expecting the spell to break and for the harsh reality of the department store to come rushing back in. He expected a shout, a security guard's firm hand on his shoulder, the embarrassed murmurs of the crowd as they dispersed, but none of that happened. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken emotion. Then, from the back of the small crowd, a single person began to clap. It wasn't a loud or aggressive clap. It was slow, deliberate, full of respect. It was the sound of appreciation, not just applause. Another person joined in, then another, and soon the entire semicircle of people was applauding. It wasn't a wild, standing ovation, but a gentle, rhythmic wave of sound that washed over him. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing he had ever heard. He opened his eyes and saw their faces. There was no judgment there, no annoyance. He saw smiles, some with tears in the corners. He saw nods of understanding. He saw a shared humanity that he had completely forgotten existed. A wave of heat washed over his face, and he looked down at the keys, feeling a surge of shyness and a gratitude, so profound it almost hurt. The applause began to die down as the real world started to intrude again. A store announcement crackled over the loudspeaker, advertising a sale on winter coats. A child somewhere started to cry. The spell was broken. The crowd began to thin out, people turning away to resume their shopping, their faces thoughtful. They would carry the music with them for a few minutes, a small, unexpected gift in their busy day, but then it would fade, just like the final chord. But not everyone left. The elderly woman with the silver-handled cane was still there. She had not moved. And a few others lingered at a distance, not wanting the moment to end completely. The young man watched as the woman began to move. She took a slow step forward, her cane tapping softly on the marble floor. The few remaining people seemed to sense her purpose and quietly stepped aside, creating a clear path for her to the piano. He felt a knot of nervousness tighten in his stomach. What did she want? Was she going to scold him? He wouldn't be able to bear that, not from her. He had seen the tear on her cheek. He had played that last song for her. As she got closer, he could see the details of her face more clearly. Her skin was soft and wrinkled like tissue paper, and her eyes, a pale, watery blue, were fixed on him with an intensity that made his heart beat faster. She stopped right beside the piano, close enough that he could see the fine patterns on her wool coat. She didn't say anything at first. She just looked at him, a complex expression on her face that was a mixture of wonder, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. He was about to stand up, to mumble an apology and leave, but she spoke first. "That was beautiful," she said. Her voice was soft and a little shaky, but it was clear and strong in the quiet space. "Thank you." He just nodded, not trusting his own voice. He felt like a schoolboy who had been caught doing something he shouldn't have, but was being praised for it instead. The woman placed a hand on the piano's glossy surface, as if to steady herself. "You have a real gift," she said, her eyes never leaving his. "Please tell me, where did you learn that song?" The question caught him off guard. He had been expecting a lecture, not a question about his music. He felt a blush creep up his neck again. "Oh, I don't know," he stammered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I didn't learn it. I'm sorry, I made it up. It was just a feeling I had." The woman's eyes widened. A look of pure, unadulterated shock spread across her face. Her hand flew to her mouth, and she took a small step back, as if he had pushed her. "No," she whispered, shaking her head slowly. "That's not possible." "You couldn't have." He was confused now. "I'm sorry," he said again, feeling a knot of panic. "Did I play something I shouldn't have? Was it someone else's song? I promise I didn't mean to." "No, no," she said quickly, holding up a hand to stop him. She took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "You don't understand? That song... I know that song. I know it better than I know my own name." She looked at him, her eyes filled with tears that she was now trying to hold back. "My husband wrote that song for me. 60 years ago." The world seemed to stop. The young man just stared at her, his mind struggling to process what she was saying. It must be a mistake. A coincidence. A melody with a few similar chords. But the look in her eyes told him it was so much more than that. "He was a musician like you," she continued, her voice trembling with the weight of the memory. "He composed it for our anniversary. He said it was the only song that could ever capture how he felt about me. He played it for me on our old piano in our little apartment. It was our song. It was the most precious thing in the world to me." She paused, a single tear finally breaking free and rolling down her cheek. "But he never wrote it down. He said it was too special, that it only existed when he played it for me. And then he passed away a few years later. I haven't heard that melody since the last time he played it for me. I thought it was gone forever. I thought I would never hear it again." She sank slowly onto the piano bench beside him, the movement slow and heavy with the weight of her years and her grief. She didn't look at him, but at the keys as if she could see her husband's fingers resting there. The young man was frozen. He couldn't speak. He couldn't move. He had been hungry and cold and lost in this huge, impersonal city. He had sat down at this piano on a whim, out of a desperate need to feel something, to create something beautiful. And in doing so, he had reached across 60 years of time and pulled a stranger's most cherished memory out of the thin air. It was impossible. It was a miracle. And in that moment, sitting there beside this woman whose past had just collided with his present, he felt a sense of awe and wonder so powerful that it erased every trace of the cold, the hunger, and the loneliness. He was no longer a ghost. He was a part of something real, something unforgettable. The silence that followed her words was the most profound silence he had ever experienced. It was a living thing, a space thick with 60 years of love, loss, and impossible music. He sat perfectly still, afraid that if he moved, if he even breathed too loudly, the delicate, miraculous moment would shatter into a million pieces. His mind, which had been a whirlwind of hunger and anxiety just minutes before, was now a blank slate. It couldn't process what she had said. It was like trying to hold a star in your hands. The concept was too big, too bright, too beautiful to comprehend. He looked from her face, wet with tears but glowing with a strange, peaceful light, down to his own hands resting on the keys. These hands, cold and hungry just a little while ago, had somehow reached back through time and plucked a forgotten melody out of the ether. The woman seemed to sense his confusion. She took another slow, deep breath, as if she were learning to breathe again after a long time underwater. A small, sad smile appeared on her lips. "I know this must sound crazy to you," she said softly, her voice regaining a little of its strength. "It sounds crazy to me, and I'm living it." She gently patted the wood of the piano, a gesture of affection for both the instrument and the memory it now held. "He always said music was in the air all around us. He said a good musician didn't create it, they just caught it. Like catching fireflies in a jar." She looked at him, her pale blue eyes piercing right through him. "I think you must be a very good musician. I think you caught our firefly." He still couldn't speak. He just shook his head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. He wanted to say something, anything, to tell her how sorry he was for her loss, how amazed he was, how he didn't understand. But the words were stuck in his throat, trapped behind a lump of pure emotion. All he could do was listen. "He was a wonderful man," she continued, her gaze distant now, looking through the piano and into the past. "He wasn't famous. He never played in a big concert hall. He just played for me, for our friends in our living room, for the birds in the trees outside our window. He said that was all the audience he ever needed. This song, it was his masterpiece, even if no one else ever heard it. It was the story of us, of how we met, of the life we built together. When he got sick, he tried to teach it to me, but my hands were never good with the piano. He said not to worry, that the music was safe, that he would always be there to play it for me. And then he was gone." Her voice broke on the last few words, and she paused, wiping her eyes with a small, delicate handkerchief she pulled from her coat pocket. "I thought the music went with him. I really did. And to hear it again after all these years, it's like he's here. It's like he's sitting right here next to me, saying hello." The weight of her story settled upon him, not as a burden, but as a sacred honor. He understood now that this wasn't a coincidence. It was something more. It was a conversation he didn't know he was a part of. He had been a vessel, a channel through which a memory could flow back into the world. The hunger in his stomach was still there, a faint, distant echo, but it was completely overshadowed by a feeling of immense, humbling gratitude. He had come into this store feeling like he had nothing, and he had been given the chance to give this woman something priceless. Finally, he found his voice. It was rough and quiet, but it was there. "I don't know how," he said, the words barely a whisper. "I was just feeling things, the cold and being alone. And then I saw the piano and I just played. I didn't think about notes. I just played what was inside me." "That's how he did it too," she said, her smile returning, this time warmer and more genuine. "He always said the best music doesn't come from your head, it comes from your heart. You must have a very big heart." She fell silent for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. She straightened up on the bench, her expression becoming more practical, more determined. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. It was a simple, old-fashioned leather wallet. She opened it and took out a thick fold of bills. She didn't count them. She just held them out to him. He immediately recoiled, shaking his head more forcefully this time. "No, oh, no. I can't. I couldn't possibly," he stammered, holding his hands up as if to ward her off. "That's not why I didn't do this for money." "I know you didn't," she said firmly. Her voice was gentle, but there was an unshakable strength in it. "And that is exactly why you must take it." She pushed the money into his hands, closing his cold fingers around the warm, thick stack of bills. It felt heavier than it should have, heavy with meaning. "This is not a payment for a song," she continued, looking him straight in the eye. "You can't put a price on what you just gave me. This is for a hot meal. This is for a warm, safe place to sleep tonight. This is so that tomorrow you can afford to buy a new notebook and a pencil, so you can write down the next song that comes from your heart. A song like that should never be lost again." Tears welled up in his own eyes now, hot and stinging. He had spent so long feeling helpless, so long feeling like his talent was worthless, a burden rather than a gift. And here was this woman, this stranger, treating his music like it was the most valuable thing in the world. He tried to push the money back, but she wouldn't let him. "Please," she said. Let me do this. It's the only way I can thank you. You gave me back a piece of my soul. Let me make sure you can take care of yours." He finally gave in, his shoulders slumping in surrender. He clutched the money in his hand, a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. "Thank you," he whispered, the words feeling inadequate. "Thank you so much." "No," she said, standing up slowly from the bench. "Thank you." She looked down at him one last time, a look of deep, heartfelt kindness on her face. "Don't you ever stop playing. You hear me? The world needs your music. It needs people who can catch the fireflies." With that, she turned and walked away, her cane tapping a soft, steady rhythm on the marble floor as she disappeared back into the crowd. He sat there for a long time, just looking at the money in his hand, then at the keys of the piano. He felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being seen, of being understood. He stood up, his legs feeling stronger than they had in weeks. He didn't look back at the piano. He didn't need to. He would carry it with him forever. He walked towards the automatic doors, and as they hissed open and the cold air hit his face, he didn't shiver. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the crisp, clean air of the city. He was still a hungry musician, but for the first time in a long, long time he felt truly, completely full.